You know that feeling when everything is fine? Nothing is wrong, no arguments, no tension, no uncertainty sitting in your chest at 2 a.m. You're treated well, you're respected, things are steady, predictable, calm. And yet, somewhere underneath all of that, something feels off. Not bad, just quiet in a way that almost feels empty. You start to notice it in small moments, when conversations feel a little too easy, when nothing pulls at you, nothing surprises you, when you realize you're not thinking about them constantly anymore, and instead of relief, there's this strange restlessness you can't quite explain. And then comes the thought you don't really say out loud. Why do I feel this way when everything is actually good? Most people don't talk about this honestly. When someone feels bored in something stable, the assumption is usually simple, that they're ungrateful, that they crave drama, that they're the kind of person who can't appreciate something healthy. But that explanation misses something deeper, because for some people, this isn't about wanting chaos. It's about how their mind learned to recognize connection in the first place. And this is where the real topic begins. There's a certain kind of person who feels an unexpected sense of boredom in healthy relationships, not because the relationship lacks value, but because their internal system doesn't fully register stability as something emotionally engaging. And that's not as simple as it sounds. There's more going on here than people realize. From a psychological perspective, the human brain doesn't just respond to what is good, it responds to what is familiar. There's a well-known principle in neuroscience, sometimes referred to as predictive coding. The brain is constantly trying to anticipate what will happen next based on past experiences. It builds patterns, and then it looks for those patterns again. So if someone grew up in an environment where love was inconsistent, where attention came and went, where closeness felt uncertain or conditional, their brain didn't just experience that, it adapted to it. Uncertainty became the thing that signaled importance. Emotional highs and lows became the rhythm that felt meaningful. The nervous system learned to stay alert, to read between the lines, to search for shifts in tone or behavior. Over time, that kind of environment wires the brain to associate intensity with connection, not consciously, but deeply. So when that same person enters a relationship where things are stable, where communication is clear, where there's no need to decode mixed signals, something unexpected happens. Their brain doesn't light up in the same way. There's less anticipation, fewer emotional spikes, less of that subtle tension that once made everything feel alive. And without realizing it, the absence of that intensity gets interpreted as boredom. But what's actually missing isn't love, it's stimulation. And that distinction matters. Because from a behavioral standpoint, the brain is heavily influenced by dopamine, the chemical often associated with motivation and reward. Dopamine isn't just about pleasure, it's about pursuit. It spikes when something is uncertain, when there's a possibility of gain, when something feels just out of reach. In inconsistent relationships, dopamine cycles are constantly activated. There's guessing, waiting, hoping, interpreting. The emotional payoff, when it comes, feels amplified. In healthy relationships, that cycle is quieter. There's less guessing, less chasing, less unpredictability, which means the brain, especially one that's used to high emotional variability, can start to feel understimulated. And that can be confusing, because logically, everything is right, but emotionally, something feels missing. This doesn't come from a place of flaw, it comes from a place of adaptation. Most of these patterns don't begin in adulthood, they're shaped much earlier. In childhood, especially, the nervous system is incredibly sensitive to the environment. If love felt inconsistent, if attention had to be earned, if emotional safety wasn't always guaranteed, the brain learned to stay engaged through alertness. It learned that calm didn't mean connection. Calm often meant distance or unpredictability waiting to happen. So instead of relaxing into stability, the system stays slightly restless, almost scanning for something more. Not because it wants chaos, but because chaos was once the language of closeness. And when that language disappears, it can feel like something important is missing, even when it isn't. It's important to understand that this isn't better or worse than any other way of experiencing relationships. Some people feel most connected in calm, steady environments. Others feel most alive in intensity and emotional movement. Neither is right or wrong. They're simply different nervous systems shaped by different histories. But here's where it gets more layered. There's a quiet paradox in all of this. The very thing that creates this sense of boredom also reflects a kind of strength, because people who are wired this way often have a deep capacity for emotional awareness. They notice subtle shifts, they feel things intensely, they can read dynamics that others might miss. That sensitivity didn't appear randomly. It was developed, it was practiced, it was necessary at some point. But the trade-off is that when they finally encounter something safe and steady, their system doesn't immediately know how to settle into it. It's like stepping into silence after years of noise. At first, the silence doesn't feel peaceful. It feels unfamiliar. And sometimes, unfamiliar gets mistaken for emptiness. So the boredom isn't really about the relationship lacking something. It's about the mind adjusting to a different kind of emotional environment, a quieter one, a slower one that doesn't constantly demand attention, but instead invites presence. And that shift can take time, more time than most people expect. Because learning to feel engaged without intensity, learning to experience connection without volatility, requires the brain to build new associations. It requires safety to feel stimulating in its own way, and that doesn't happen overnight. What matters here is not forcing a different reaction or judging the one that's already there. It's understanding it. Seeing that this response has a history, that it makes sense in context, that it once served a purpose. Because when you see it that way, something changes. The boredom stops feeling like a personal failure and starts feeling like a signal. Not a signal that something is wrong with you, but a signal that your system is adjusting to something it hasn't fully learned yet. And that's a very different kind of experience. You're not broken for feeling this way. You're not incapable of appreciating something healthy. You're just navigating the space between what your mind was trained to expect and what it's now being offered. And that space can feel confusing, but it's also where new patterns begin. If any part of this feels familiar, there's more to understand about how your mind builds connection and why certain feelings show up the way they do. Not everything that feels like boredom is what it seems, and sometimes what feels quiet at first is actually where something deeper is trying to grow. If this felt familiar in a quiet, hard-to-explain way, there's more to uncover about how your mind experiences connection. You can stay with this, like, subscribe, and explore what else might start to make sense.